So last week, I'm really sorry I missed it, but I caught the reruns online. So last week, Reverend June preached a fabulous sermon entitled The Worst Sermon Ever. And for the record, that was a reference to Jonah's sermon, not hers. Hers was brilliant, as always. Mine is at least shorter, slightly anyway. Jonah's sermon was basically, yet 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed. And so today my title is an even worse sermon, with apologies to Reverend June for stealing your title. And with any luck, y'all will figure that the title refers to the prophet Elijah's sermon and not mine, but that remains to be seen. And Elijah's sermon actually comes before the reading that Gordon did. Thank you, Gordon. Where'd you go? Thanks. And so I'm going to give you a little background first. And the reading that Gordon did begins with Elijah on the lam. And like the prophet Jonah last week, he's running away from something. Not God this time, but Jezebel. Ever heard of Jezebel? Ever been called a Jezebel? I have, and so have many women ministers. Jezebels. Well, Jezebel was the queen of Israel. She was married to her husband Ahab, the king, not the Ahab from the novel Moby Dick, although that would be a great tie-in to last Sunday's sermon, which, as Reverend June explained, was not about a whale, but I digress. So back to why Elijah's on the lam. Now, before Elijah ever meets the widow in the reading, this is why he's running away in the first place. King Ahab, who the Bible flat out tells us is the worst king Israel ever had, there are probably some parallels that I'm not going to go into. But believe me, the evil competition was fierce, and he had married Jezebel of Sidon and gone all in for worshiping Baal. You know, altars, sacrifices to idols, the works, you know. And enter Elijah, bold as brass, who marches into the royal court and basically says, because of you and your Baal nonsense, there's not going to be any rain in this land until I say so. Mic drop. Cue the drought and famine. Cue the misery and starvation. Because let's be honest, calling down a drought in an agrarian economy is not a plan for popularity. So this is definitely in the running for the worst sermon ever. And as Reverend June noted last week, and as Jesus reiterated in our second reading from the Gospel according to Luke, prophets tend to be generally unpopular people. So suddenly, Elijah is persona non grata, the most wanted man in Israel, with Ahab furious, Jezebel sharpening her knives, and a whole nation starving because of the drought that he declared. So Elijah hides. You know, good plan, Elijah. And first he camps out by a stream, eating whatever the ravens drop off, like some sort of flying wilderness Uber Eats. But when the brook dries up, because of the drought he called down, God sends him on a road trip, on foot, right into enemy territory, Sidon, Jezebel's home turf, by the way, and straight to the door of a poor widow who is herself on the verge of starvation. And this is important. The widow of Zarephath is not an Israelite. She's a Gentile, she's a foreigner outside the covenant story, and yet God chooses her. And at the beginning of this sermon series on loving our neighbor as ourselves, we looked at the story of Rahab the prostitute, another person who might have been called an enemy, someone with a different religion, like the widow of Zarephath, a foreigner in enemy territory. And in a world that builds walls and draws hard lines about who's in and who's out, this is radical. Because once again, we're about to see God blessing radical hospitality. And God places the survival of the prophet in the hands of the marginalized, the foreigner, the one with nothing. The very person that Elijah might have ignored or even blamed for Israel's troubles becomes his lifeline. Now, years ago, I remember going to a global general conference of our denomination. This was like decades ago. I'm guessing when I talk about it, maybe Reverend Diane and Reverend Karma might remember it. And at the time, we were debating restructuring our denomination in a way that paired churches in the so-called first world countries, mainly in the US, because that's where most MCC churches are, with churches in the so-called third world. By the way, I hate those terms. You know, first world, third world. First of all, what's the second world? I don't know, don't tell me. And more importantly, we absolutely do not need any more ways to divide ourselves geographically or otherwise. And as I keep saying over and over and over again, neighbor is not a geographical designation, it is a moral imperative, okay? Anyhow, back to our conference. Is this beginning to ring a bell to you guys? You remember this? Was that the one in Toronto? I think it was. So that was 2001? Okay, 24 years ago. And to my lasting embarrassment, many of the churches in the US were extremely resistant to this idea. And their response was, well, we don't have enough resources for our own churches. How can you ask us to share? And I really just wanted to slap a few people upside the head. You know, it was embarrassing to me. It still is. And then a prophet arose. I do not remember his name. I wish I did. I do remember that he got up to the microphone and spoke in Spanish through a translator, and he said, "We are not los pobrecitos. We are not the little poor ones asking you to take care of us. We too have gifts and talents to share with the broader church and the world. Do not dismiss us." Do you remember that? Do you remember who it was? I wish I knew. Anyhow, it's definitely in the running for the best sermon ever. Do not dismiss our global neighbors. So let's step back a minute, look at the story of Elijah and the widow from the benefit of, 3,000 or 4,000 years of hindsight. And here we meet two people from totally opposite worlds. Elijah, this fiery prophet of Israel, and an unnamed widow in Zarephath, a foreign land. But this is not just a story about charity. I don't know if you all remember from a couple of sermons back, I noted that when we're looking at ways to love our neighbor, charity isn't necessarily enough. What is more often called for to love our neighbor is true solidarity. And in this story, we see it again, because it's a story about interdependence and accountability and the holy disruption of who we call our neighbor. Because charity helps, but solidarity transforms. And it transforms both the giver and the receiver. And here at MCC Toronto, we like to say we're about transformation, transforming our lives, and thereby, one by one, transforming the world. And in solidarity, this is also a story of shared survival in the shadow of a crisis. And it has to be said, and I keep saying it, a crisis that Elijah himself helped create. Who called down the drought that inevitably led to famine and starvation? Elijah, who's starving, the widow and her only son. And when Elijah meets her, she's gathering sticks to cook a last meal for herself and her son before they die. Because that's the last of their food. There ain't no more. And Elijah, this fugitive prophet who helped cause the drought, has the audacity, pardon me, the absolute brass balls, to demand bread from her. And at first glance, this seems cruel. Come to think of it, at second glance, it still seems cruel. But it's also deeply human. Elijah shows up with nothing but need, and the widow's got nothing left to give. And the world so often demands a lot from people who are already vulnerable. And the world sometimes doesn't demand enough accountability from people who are complicit in creating that vulnerability and, frankly, misery and danger. So, who are some of the modern equivalents of Elijah? Thank you. There are leaders and governments and corporations and sometimes even churches whose actions bring about drought and famine and displacement, climate change and droughts and food insecurity, refugees at the border, and we cannot escape the fact that today there are millions of people in places like Gaza and South Sudan and Congo and Afghanistan and many other places, too many, facing starvation, children wasting away while leaders play power games. And then Elijah speaks drought into being. But today, we benefit from systems that cause droughts and climate collapse and war and blockades. And it's the widows and children who pay first. There's an old Indian proverb, when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. So loving our neighbor doesn't always mean giving out of our abundance. Sometimes loving our neighbor means sharing what little we have left. And sometimes it means receiving with humility what we do not even deserve. And that is the risk of loving our neighbor. Now, the miracle in this story isn't flashy. No thunderbolts, no manna from heaven, just a jar of flour that doesn't go empty, a jug of oil that doesn't run dry. Enough for today, and then enough again for tomorrow. And like the manna in the wilderness, when the Israelites were wandering in the desert for 40 years, God didn't just dump 40 years worth of manna on them. It came day by day, like our daily bread. And that's often how God's abundance shows up in the quiet, daily miracle of survival, sustained by mutual care. It does not show up in stockpiling and hoarding wealth. That is the opposite of a miracle. That's a monstrous thing, just saying. And notice, the miracle isn't just for Elijah. It is not just for the prophet of God, it's for the widow and her child too. The stranger, the foreigner in enemy territory, the one who risked everything for a stranger, finds herself saved and sustained as well. By the way, you may or may not have noticed that the widow of Zarephath is not named in the scripture. And so often, the people that God chooses to be the agents of God's love and grace are women without names, women whose names have been forgotten, marginalized women who are essential to God's story but erased from the record. And sadly, I just have a sneaking suspicion that the widow of Zarephath has many, many names in our world today. So what does this story teach us about loving our neighbor? A couple of things. You knew that was a rhetorical question, didn't y'all? You knew I was going to answer it, probably at too much length. But this story teaches us, one, love of neighbor includes accountability. Elijah had to come face to face with the very real human cost of his words and deeds. And also, love of neighbor requires humility from the powerful. Elijah had to receive from someone he might have overlooked or rejected. Neighbor love is most powerful when it flows across borders. And the prophet and the widow, truly an odd couple, sustain each other's lives. I always like to challenge us to try and see ourselves in the scriptures. Some of us come like Elijah, bearing the weight of systems that we helped create or at least benefit from. And some of us come like the widow, exhausted in every way, stretched thin, wondering if love is still worth the risk, wondering if life as we know it is over. But when we meet each other with honesty and courage, when we dare to share what little we have, God multiplies the miracle. and together we live. Amen.